I've always been captivated by double exposure photography. I'm sure you've heard that old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But what happens when you compound those pictures? Is the final product greater than the sum of its parts? Well, we're not here to really talk about art philosophy. We're here to learn how to reproduce this technique inside of Photoshop. So if you want to follow along with this tutorial, I have left a link in the description below. That includes all of my source files and all of the art files I'm using to create what you see on your screen here. You're watching ShinobiPixel. My name is Alan. Let's get into it. So this is, of course, the piece we're going to recreate today. It is made up of 4 different images that I've composited together, and I will go through kind of the decisions behind why I'm doing what I'm doing as I show you how to use the tools to accomplish this technique. So let's get started. Create a blank canvas. I've created one that's 800 pixels wide by 1200 pixels tall, and the only reason I did that really was just to kind of match my source material. And my source material is this lovely young lady right here, which I'm going to take and drag onto my canvas. You want to name your layer. I'm just going to call this layer subject because she is the subject matter of this piece. And you'll notice when I dragged it in, it's quite a bit bigger than my canvas size, and that is good. We're going to scale it down. But I'm not just going to transform it. I'm going to first convert it into a smart object. And you can do that by right-clicking on your layer palette and selecting Convert to Smart Object. Now, why do we want to convert to Smart Object? You can scale a Smart Object down and then back up to 100% of its original size and not have any quality loss, which is pretty convenient. But there is another reason why we want to convert this to a Smart Object. We're going to tap into the power of the Smart Object here. Double click on the Smart Object thumbnail, and you'll notice now your subject opens up in a new window, subject.psb. So this is the flattened source material. This is just our base graphic. And the first thing I want to do is extract her from the background. Now you can do this any number of ways that you want. But before we do that, one thing I like to do is actually introduce a color in behind, because we're going to be extracting her against a transparent background. And because she's black and white, I just want to make sure I've accounted for as many of those white pixels as I can. You'll see what I mean in a second. So what I'm going to do is just go down to my layers menu and click on a new adjustment layer. I'm going to add a solid color, and I'm just going to add something that's going to be like a pretty high contrast. So I'm going to go with a green. Same idea as a green screen, and I'll drag that underneath my subject. Obviously, she's still got a white background, so you can't see that green underneath. And I think in this case, I'm just going to use the quick selection tool. In the interest of time for this tutorial, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to cut her out of the background. So there we go. I've created my selection. If this is the method you're going to do to create the selection, what I would recommend after is going to your select menu, modifying your selection, and expanding it by just 1 pixel. And that'll help ensure that you've kind of accounted for as much of the fringe on the edges as possible. So then what you want to do is create a layer mask out of your selection. I'm going to invert my selection just by pressing Control-Shift-I, I think Command-Shift-I on a Mac. And then we will go down to our layers menu again and click this icon for add layer mask. And now we've successfully extracted our subject out of the background. And you can see if I zoom in a little bit, that quick selection tool did a pretty good job. I mean, there's still a bit of rough edges that we can go in and clean up. And I know on her ear, it cut a little bit of that shine off her ear. So we'll just quickly refine that mask. And I will do that by grabbing a hard edge brush, make it smaller, and I'm just gonna paint white inside of my mask. I guess I gotta crank up my opacity here. And paint back in the information that we lost when we masked out her body from the background. And I think everything else looks pretty good. Now, one other thing to note here. There's a hard edge on her shoulder. If I move the layer, you can see that. So what I'm going to do is expand the boundaries of our image mask I'll grab the pen tool and just kind of draw out where I think her arm would naturally go. And I'll close that. Then I will right click and make selection. I'll hit OK, and there we go. Now we can expand our mask just a little bit. So I'll grab my white paintbrush and I will paint inside the bounds of that selection. Now obviously you're not seeing anything happen, and that's because there's no information to fill in yet. So what I'm going to do is go to my clone tool, and just with a soft edge brush, I'll boost this up. I'm going to press Alt or Option on my keyboard and sample something from her arm, and then I will start drawing it in. And just by doing this, you can see now that I'm filling in pixel information, and it's being constrained by the bounds of the mask extension we just created. Now I didn't do a great job with that mask, but that's okay. We can fix that. I'll just go and select my layer mask again, grab my selection tool, and just drag a rectangle somewhere, and then I'll press Control or Command T, and I'll just pull downwards on that selection, and you can see I've filled that in now. I mean, there's still a bit of refinement I can do. Maybe I'll take my smudge tool and just kind of fix that sharp edge I've given her here. I think that's good enough for now. I mean, it's a quick tutorial. I don't want to take up too much of your time. So we're going to go ahead and save that, and watch what happens when you go back to your original image. You can see that the green background shows up, and that's not what we want, of course. So in your subject.psb, you can just hide or delete the color fill layer that we used to try and see her background there. And I'll close that, and I didn't do a super job on her arm. You'll want to probably spend a little more time than I did cutting her out, but that's okay. We will center her, and you need to save your composition. I just realized I haven't saved yet. All right, so I've saved my document, and I also went back in and just cleaned up the edge of that mask just a little bit more. So now I'm pretty happy with it. Now you might be asking why we cut her out in the first place, and that is because I am going to use her as both a clipping mask and a layer mask, and that just means that if I make a selection around her, I can add different adjustment layers, different colors, and of course mask out all of the nature pictures we're going to incorporate into this. The next step is I don't really want to put her against a white background. I think I kind of want to put an off-white background in behind her. So let's go ahead and do the same technique we did before, where we go into the layer menu and select a solid color adjustment layer. And I'm just going to go with EC as my hex value here. It's kind of an eggshell or an off-white, and it's got a little bit of warmth to it. And I'll call this BG, and I'll drag it underneath my subject layer, and then we can just delete the existing background layer. There we go. I think that looks a little better. It looks a little more natural. Nothing is perfectly white in reality. So, all right, our next step is to bring in the mountain layer, and I have that over here, so I'm just going to drag it onto my composition. And before I do anything else, we're going to rename it Mountains, and I will right-click on the layer, Convert to Smart Object, because I like working in a way that allows me to non-destructively edit my composition. Okay, so you can see obviously my mountain layer is a little bigger than my canvas, so we'll just scale that down. I'm going to figure out placement here, and in order to do that, I'm going to employ a blending mode in my layers so that we can see what we're doing, and this is actually going to help us achieve the effect we want. So the blending mode we're going to choose is lighten, and you can choose that by hovering over this where it says normal on your layers menu and select lighten. So how this blending mode works is it takes into account the brights and darks on the layer it's been applied to in relation to the layers underneath. It keeps whichever of the two is lightest. So in this case, everything we can see in the mountain range is lighter in color than what is on our subject. If I hide the layer, you can see she's largely illuminated from the right side of the composition, so the left side's a little bit darker. And when we apply that lighten to our composition, you can see that all the highlights from the mountains kind of shine over top of where she is dark. So it gives us this cool effect. And then we can play with the placement of the image. And I actually kind of like where I have it here because this snow patch kind of runs down and it kind of falls in line naturally with where her nose is positioned. I think maybe I want to resize my mountains just a little bit. So I will tweak it slightly, hit enter, and there we go. So now we have our mountains. So you're starting to see already how this effect takes shape. There's one more thing we need to do with the mountains layer, and that is to mask it to our subject. Because watch what happens if I hide my background layer. Those mountains shine through. In reality, this mountain layer is going to affect any layers we put underneath our subject as well. So we want to just ensure that it's only clipped to our subject. And of course, the best way to do that in this case is going to be to apply a clipping mask. Now, in order to apply a clipping mask, you want to move your mouse in between these two layers in this line here. And then on your keyboard, you press Alt or Option if you're a Mac user, and your mouse should turn into a cursor that looks like a downward arrow next to a square. And if that's what you see, then left click, and obviously nothing happened visually that you could see right there. But if I hide my background layer now, you can see those transparent pixels. And that is perfect. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. All right, so now I want to shift focus a little bit. The lower half of this image doesn't really have a lot of detail aside from just what's coming through from our subject matter, because of course these highlights are brighter than anything in the mountains layer. So when we change that layer blending mode to lighten, nothing from the mountains was showing up. And this was an issue I found when I was trying to source images for this composition. So I ended up coming across this picture and I thought it was really great. So we're going to drag it into our comp. And there you go. Again, first thing we have to do is rename it. Let's call it forest and convert to smart object like so. And then we'll scale it down. Now, the thing I really loved about this forest graphic was the level of contrast between the trees and the sky. And that's perfect for what we're trying to do here. I'm going to place this down at sort of the bottom end of this graphic. And then again, we're going to employ another blending mode. This time it's not going to be lighten, it's going to be screen. Like that. And you can see that the information from the trees and the forest are coming through pretty nicely, and you can kind of still see her skin tones underneath. So what I want to do now is, again, clip this layer to our subject, but we've got a bit of a problem now because it's a little bit too highlighted. And we can fix that pretty easily by applying a layer mask using a soft-edged brush and selecting my forest layer. I'm going to click this button down here to add a layer mask. And my foreground needs to be black because we're actually going to paint away. Remember with layer masks, black is hide, light is show. And I'm literally just going to start painting this out. Now again, I'm using a soft edged brush because I want to leave a lot of the information from the trees, but I think it's important to brush away from the edges, and this step requires a little bit of finesse, and there's no real science to it. It's just kind of art. You got to do what looks good. You can see there's still a lot of color information here. We've got some blues and red tones going on, and if that's something you like the look of, then consider this next step to be optional. But when I was first kind of envisioning this piece, I was thinking in terms of grayscale. So I'm going to add a grayscale adjustment layer, and you can do this by clicking down here, selecting black and white, and this creates a black and white adjustment layer. And you can play with some of the different channels to make changes. There's not a lot of color information to play with here, but if I start fiddling around with these reds, you can see what happens. I'm pulling out red information and turning that more white. If I wanted it darker, I'd slide this down here. So you can just play around with it, figure out what looks best to your eye. I kind of like how this is looking. And then, of course, we want to clip this adjustment layer to our subject. So I'm going to, again, take my mouse, hover in between these two layers, press the Alt or Option button, click down. And there we go. We've applied our black and white layer. And if you want to leave a little bit of color depth, you can always play with this fill slider. But again, this is subjective. It comes down to the look you're going for. All right, so this is shaping up really nicely. One thing I'm a little worried about, though, is I'm losing some of the detail in her face. It's getting a little washed out, and I can't really see some of the detail around her shoulder. So I want to bring that information back out just a bit. And one of the best ways I've found to do this is to duplicate our subject and bring a layer above everything else, and again, play with a blending mode. There is a trick to doing this. I don't want to unlink all of my clipping masks, so I'm going to hit Command or Control J to duplicate my subject. And now you can see it's created a copy, but it's maintained those clipping masks. And that's okay. So what I'll do is I'll just change this one to subject base. And I'll change this one to subject details. Then we're going to take subject details and bring it all the way to the top. And then we're going to add a blending mode. So we will select soft light, and you can see the effect that has right away. It really brings out the highlights in her shoulders, brings out the highlights in her jawline, brings out the highlights on her lips, on her nose. However, it also darkens everything underneath too. It's really playing with those shadows. So I'm gonna change the fill to roughly 60%. And I think that gives us a happy balance of blacks and whites. And I will hit save. In an effort to keep my PSD clean, I'm going to put all of these layers into a group. And you can do that by first selecting the top layer and then pressing and holding Shift and selecting your bottom layer. And then all of those layers in between are now selected, and you can either hit Control or Command G to create a group. And then we'll just call this subject and hit save. Now that I've got her in a group, I can start working on the top part of this piece. I kind of want to get rid of some of the stuff around here, up where her hair is. And the best way to do that, I think, is to create a layer mask. So down at the bottom of our layers window, there's the Add Layer Mask button, which I will click. I will select a soft brush with a black foreground color, and I can just start painting it away. That looks pretty good. Now, I'm going to employ a harder edged brush around this section here, just because I want this part to be pretty clean. And I'll just fast forward this so you don't have to sit there and watch the tedium of me painting around some mountains. Just make some refinements. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. She's cut out now, and we can see what that looks like without the layer mask and with the layer mask. So I think it adds some interest, because now we've got some white space in here, and the contrast is a lot more juxtaposed, which I really dig. Okay, so there's one last thing we need to do, and that's to apply our cloud layer. So I've got this graphic here that I'm going to drag onto my composition. We're going to rename it. We'll call it clouds. And we will convert it to a smart object just like we've done in the past. And then we'll just resize it. And position it underneath our subject. And I'm going to go into the cloud smart object by double clicking on the thumbnail. And here we go. So here's the scene. Here's the stock image that we've got to work with. We don't want any of the information from the foreground, of course. We just want to extract some information from the sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab an elliptical marquee and I'm going to draw out a pretty big selection of the sky. And then over here in the Select and Mask tool, I'm going to click this button. And in the Properties view, I'm going to drag up this feather slider to probably 260 sounds like a good number. And you can see here, that is what our selection looks like now. I can work with that. There's no hard edges. We've got some detail in the cloud still. So I'm going to hit OK. And then you'll notice my selection is still here. All I need to do now is apply a layer mask by going to the bottom of the Layers menu, clicking the Add Mask button. And there we go. Now I don't want a blue background on a grayscale image. So one last thing I'll do is, again, create an adjustment layer, and we'll just select black and white. And I may want to just tweak the brightness and contrast. We'll select another adjustment layer, go into brightness and contrast, and I'm going to bring the brightness up a little bit, and I will turn the contrast down a little bit. We'll hit save, and then I'm not going to close this. I just want to go and look at our graphic to see how that looks. And actually, I'm really happy with how that's shaping up. Got a little bit of a hard edge up top, but that's probably because that's where our cloud layer ends. Yeah, so we can reposition that. And there we go. I'm pretty happy with that, I think. So you can see some of the cool swirling textures in that cloudy sky. And they play really nicely with the mountaintops against her head, and I think that just looks awesome. So that's pretty much it. I mean, I think I'm pretty happy with how this is shaping up. There's one last thing we can really do to kind of refine this a little bit. If I wanted to go in and kind of paint away some of these snow patches, because I think they're kind of creating distraction, I can go into our subject folder. I can start applying masks to our mountain layer. And with a soft edged brush and a black foreground color, I can start painting away some of these textures. Beauty. And then I'll hit save. I think maybe I want to take down my subject details, fill just a little bit. Let's take it down to 50. And there we go. I think this is starting to look really good. All right, so the last thing I want to do is just start reintroducing a bit of color back into this piece. And I'm going to add an adjustment layer, maybe like a sepia tone. So you can do that by going down into your Layers menu and clicking here to the Adjustments Layer section and grabbing a photo filter. And then there's actually a sepia preset that you can select down here. And that looks pretty nice actually at 25%. So maybe I'll just keep it there. I will hit save and we will rename this sepia. Cool. And then I'm going to add some splashes of color by creating a new layer. We'll call this one Paint. And I'm thinking I want to introduce maybe like a purplish tone and maybe some blues as well. Something like that. All right, those colors look nice together. So I'll grab my paintbrush and just give it a soft edge. And I think I'll do purple on this side. Kind of get the shadows. Maybe down here some more purple. And then up here, why not do a little bit of blue? Let's see how that plays out. Okay, so this might look a little weird to you at the moment, but there's a method to the madness. If we go into the layers menu and change this to lighten, you can see what adding some color actually does. And you can just kind of play around with your brush and start painting away and getting some really interesting effects. And if you don't like it, if it's a little bit too much, you can always play with your fill. And opacity. But I think applying a nice little bit of color actually helps quite a bit. And I think our subject is still a bit on the dark side. So let's just go into the subject details and we'll bring down that fill another 10%. And there we go. Might add a bit more paint. Select lighten and change the fill. And there we go. I think I'm pretty happy with how this is shaping up. Perfect. Okay, and now I'm just going to group these layers and we'll call it colorize. And that way I can always enable or disable it depending on how I feel. But I actually really like how this looks. So I'll save. And yeah, I mean, that pretty much wraps up this tutorial. You know, nothing crazy. It's not really all that difficult technically. There's a few steps you got to take, but by and large, it's pretty easy to create one of these double exposure style images, just playing around with blending modes on your layers and using masks in appropriate places and just painting in spots that you want to highlight, painting out spots that you want to exclude. It's all about finessing, really. And I think, honestly, the biggest key to this entire piece, if you've stuck around with this tutorial this long, your takeaway here isn't so much the technical side, how to do things. The biggest, I think anyway, the biggest secret to making a really good double exposure image is starting off with really good, really compelling source material. I spent hours trying to find the 4 graphics that I put together for this piece, trialing things and deciding they didn't work for one reason or another before I came up with the photos that come together to make this piece look, I think, pretty cool. So anyway, that is the takeaway. Spend the time to find the right photos and you can't go wrong. So I hope you found this helpful. Let me know if you did in the comments, or if you want to leave some critiques about how I do these tutorials. That would help me out a lot. And of course, so would smashing the like button, and so would subscribing. But anyway, this has been another ShinobiPixel tutorial. I am Alan. Until next time, thanks for tuning in. We bop and hippity hop, I'm as happy as I can be. So we can hit save. Uh-oh.